Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know some folks that might be interested in coming on and chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11. Reach out to me on Mastodon, where my handle there is IsaacR11 at fossadon.org. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm really looking forward to my conversation. We're going to have a great one about all sorts of different tech topics. Today, my guest is Bryan Hogan. Bryan, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Hey, Isaac, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation for tons of reasons. I've been a huge fan of content that you create and your podcast. I've been a guest on your podcast, so I think it's safe to return the favor of you being on my podcast.
Yeah. It's about time I came on.
Yeah. It's been a while. Yeah. So
it's a few years. Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't even remember what we talked about. Do you remember?
Yeah, I think it was application insights that probably I was talking a lot about application insights for a while there when I used to work at Microsoft. So yeah, Bryan, do you want to maybe introduce yourself and kind of tell the folks what you're known for in the tech space?
The little bit I'm known is for primarily my blog, I'd say. I have a blog, a technical blog, primarily writing about .NET. It's been going for a little over 10 years. It's odd when I look back on it. It has been that long.
10 years, yeah.
A few years after starting the blog, I started a podcast. And with podcasts, you never know if you're going to keep going. And I did, though. It was 2 episodes a month for the first number of years. And then when COVID hit, it dropped to about 1 a month. And that's primarily tech as well. But I do touch on a lot of other topics. And I particularly enjoy ones on health, whether it's physical health or mental health. I've had ones on repetitive strain injury, which was very helpful for myself. And then Mads Torgersen came on to talk about ADHD. That was his first time talking publicly about it. So it's not just tech. So it can be a mix of heavy tech and other things.
Yeah, so first off, we'll talk about the podcast a lot, but if you like tech podcasts or listening to people in tech, because you're listening to this one, for instance, definitely check out the No Dogma podcast. We'll probably be talking about that a lot as we go. So I love to kind of ask my guests to start, what is I use the phrase tech origin story, but what is the point in time when you came across technology, you first got started with technology, or you realized that hey, I like computers and maybe this could be something?
I do remember it. I'm from a pretty small town in Ireland. And there was one day my mother and father went to a slightly bigger town. And They were going off to do some shopping. I was about the age of 6. And they came home with a new television and a computer. Completely unexpected. I knew that they were thinking about getting a new TV and doing some other things. But a computer came in, and it was an Amstrad CPC, which stood for Color Professional Computer. I can't remember exactly. 464. So 64 kilobytes and a tape deck. Green screen monitor, came with this intro tape, which would do a few little demos of what the computer could do. Back then, what it could do was amazing.
Yeah.
And then 1 or 2 little games. And it came with a book on programming in BASIC.
Okay.
So 10, hi Bryan, 20, go to 10.
Yep.
And that was my first program. And I think from then on, that was it. We always had a computer in the house from then on. So it moved on to Amigas. I don't know if those were popular in the US or not, Isaac, Amiga computers.
No.
So Commodore Amiga was a disk drive computer.
Yeah.
And then on PCs.
Yeah, it's quite funny because so the last episode of the show, we had Chris O'Dell, who's also from the UK, and their first computer was an Amstrad as well. So that's 2 shows in a row where folks are, it's so funny because depending on, and I talk about this a lot, depending on what generation you're from, your origin story probably is very one of 2 different ways. There's the CDs by mail, folks, or code by looking at a magazine and then typing it all out.
Yes, did that too.
Yep. There's the groups that maybe my generation that got started in tech by web design, web stuff, Web 2.0 was very, very big when I was getting started in tech. So needing to know HTML and some form of CSS, some form of JavaScript, that was kind of thing. So you said you had computers in the home for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Did you go, and I think you kind of mentioned this a little bit already, you went down that path of becoming obsessed with it to an extent?
No, I wouldn't say obsessed, but I was always comfortable. So that was kind of the
Yeah.
big difference. So at some age, my school got a computer. So this was,
Hmm.
when schools used to get one computer
Yep.
and then everyone would get a turn on it. And the teaching wasn't fantastic. There was this expectation that you would memorize the rote steps. And if you didn't get them right, the teacher would be upset with you.
Yeah.
But, kids were intimidated. They never didn't have a
Yeah.
computer at home. They weren't used to it. So for me, it was easy. But for them, it was a daunting kind of experience. And I'd be
Sure.
whispering to them, press Control C or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Um, I don't remember what kind of computer those were, but I didn't really start doing any programming, I'd say, until I was 14 or 15. So, like you said, copying out of magazines was pretty common. And then it was fun to try to, take lines out of the program and see what would happen. And, you learn pretty quickly when you took for loop out, the program broke down much more quickly than taking out other lines. Um, so yeah, but I think when we switched to PCs and I started learning a little bit of C, that was more when I got into proper programming.
Yeah. And do you remember like some of the examples that you would get like that, the code by mail or the code magazines? Like,
Mm.
do you remember like what some of the programs were?
Games mainly. I remember this rescue game where you had a little helicopter and you controlled it by the cursors and you'd pick things out of the water and you had to avoid flying into rocks. Or there was a very primitive Star Wars trench or tunnel game. And then other little things like playing blackjack or other things. They weren't so very consequential. Again, this is the 1980s.
Yeah.
So computers were new. You weren't doing enormously useful things out of
Sure.
a magazine. It was just to play and mess around a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe so. I think I had a very similar experience. Like I was very comfortable. Like we had a computer in the back of the class too, and like you could play like Snake or some other like learning game. And that was like I believe that was like a Macintosh 2, I think that's what that computer was. So like
Mm.
that kind of shows like early
Yeah.
90s. That's kind of when I was in primary elementary school. So as you're going through this path and you're comfortable with computers, more comfortable with computers, and I guess you say your classmates were. At some point in time, when did you find out that you wanted to do it like for a living, or when you wanted to like, I guess, put more effort into it or more work into like learning all of it? Was it the CDs by mail and like the ability of like learning, building things, and putting and figuring out how things work? Was it that, or was something else?
The education system in Ireland, I think, is probably worth telling you a little bit about. When you go to university in Ireland, you've picked the course you're doing. So there
Mm,
isn't kind of majors and minors. You are doing computer engineering, you're doing computer science, you are doing civil engineering, you are doing history and politics, whatever it happens to be. And you don't generally chop and change during those four
sure.
years. So by the time you've applied to university when you're 17, 18, or 19, you have picked a number of degree courses, and the one you get into them based on a scoring mechanism, doesn't really
Sure.
matter. But the one you get into is the one you're doing. So I got into a telecommunications and software course. So it was a bit of a mix of those things. So kind of the choice was made, I guess. I made that choice by looking at the course outline and going, that sounds like a bit of a jack of all trades. It's not
Yeah.
pure computer engineering. It's not pure computer science. It's not electronic engineering. It's a mix of networking, telecommunications, and software. And then what I found was I really enjoyed learning networking protocols. And that
Sure.
kind of became something I was quite good at and strong at. And that's what I went on to do a master's on with wireless protocols. So, prior to going to university, I was thinking about going into chefing and things like that because I had worked in a kind of a somewhat fancy-ish restaurant that I
Okay.
enjoyed. But, I also kind of realized you know, it was an enjoyable thing for a summer, but it
Yeah.
wouldn't have satisfied my
Sure.
interest. I guess I would have felt I should try computers and see if I like it,
Yeah.
is what it comes down to. And I did, and I did.
Yeah. So here's a question that, I mean, I don't have a lot of knowledge or insight into like the school system in Ireland, so I appreciate that. Like, so what happens in the situation where, say for instance, you're in the computer engineering or whatever, like
Yep.
curriculum, and you're in your, what happens if like halfway through it, you're like, I don't like this? Do you have
So
the ability to kind of navigate, or is it like you kind of got to
it
stick to the program and
it
then,
varies. So
yeah,
some people would change from engineering to electronic engineering because the courses are have a lot of
sure.
overlap. But if you wanted to say go and study European studies or history, you would be back to year one.
Mm,
That's because you wouldn't have been studying any of the courses that are related to European history while you were doing 1 or 2 years of computer engineering. You don't get that broad base of courses that you might get here. It's so like in my first year, we had two semesters. I think it was 6 modules per semester. At least 5 of them were heavily related to the main thrust of what we're doing. And then there might have been one that was a little bit off to the side, dealing with, physics or statics and dynamics or engineering principles, general engineering principles.
sure.
But then as you kind of made your way through the years, the courses were much more tailored for telecommunications protocols,
They get more
communications
specialized.
theory. Yes. So as you
Yeah,
moved on, they became more. So the way it worked was your first year, a number of the modules could be used for quite a variety of courses. And by the time you were getting to third and fourth year, you and your classmates were the only people in the room, as
yeah.
opposed to, oh, some of the computer science guys are in, or some of the information theory people are here, or whatever it is. So yeah, the changing is not, it certainly wasn't common when I was there.
Yeah, and I think, knowing you a pretty well amount, like you've kind of moved in your career to, you know, I don't want to say web stuff because I think
Mm,
in general like web stuff is really generic, but like you've kind of stuck like in this area of like, specialized APIs. So
mm,
like I guess the reason why I asked that are curious is the things that you learned in university, for instance. I know that it was a long time ago, but are there things occasionally that you're like, oh, like this helped me do this thing today, or has like 99% of the things that you know today that you are, for your work, they're from on the job sort of training.
I would say the latter, yeah. So I mean, I studied languages like I think we did Pascal first, and then C++, and then Java. So Java to some degree would help, but then I did a master's degree in telecommunications, and again that was protocols. I
Mm-hmm.
worked briefly in the telecommunications industry, but I realized that there weren't a lot of jobs in
Sure.
telecommunications. So then I transitioned more to software. And from then on, it was purely on the job and then after hours or weekends learning. The master's degree was by research, so there were no classes. So you
Okay.
pretty much pick a topic and you learn it for yourself, and then you write a thesis at the end. I would say those couple of years set me up for independent learning, and that
Yeah.
that kind of, okay, I can figure this out by myself. And I'll go, okay, I'll get the occasional bit of guidance from a supervisor or from somebody, but I have to do this myself. And
Yeah.
there's no one setting a timetable with classes and
Sure. Yeah.
exams. And,
Yeah.
it's all on me. I have to have this 200-page document at the end, or I've wasted my 2 years or whatever it happens to be. So
Yeah.
that kind of, I suppose, self-directed learning was the thing that carried on for a long time.
That's really interesting. And one thing that I'd love to talk with you about is learning in general. Like, I
Mm,
mean, I get like the idea of like, oh, pick a topic and in 2 years give us a 200-page paper. Like that
mm.
sounds there's a lot in the middle, right, that needs to
There
occur.
is.
And rightfully slow. So I'd imagine that research then was a bit different than what research is now, right? So
Yes.
how was that experience for you? I mean, not to say that like you were kind of given like a black box and like, okay, figure out the black box and here's the output, right? You have an input with an idea, output with a paper or
Hmm.
dissertation or whatever they're called, thesis or whatnot. So like that in the middle, like what did you realize pretty quickly was like really good avenues for learning for you?
So back then, obviously we had internet, we had web, but we didn't have the powerful search engines of today.
Hmm.
And then you had to rely a lot on published articles, so magazine articles. And I don't mean consumer magazines, I mean journals. So I should have said journals, and papers that were published. I went to academic conferences. So you had to be able to navigate those sort of resources, read the abstract of the paper, determine if it was useful to you or not, and then get in touch with the author sometimes. So I had relationships with a few people that were working in my area. I think they were at Carnegie Mellon, um, getting a little bit of help from them or helping them with things occasionally. So, it was the same kind of thing of building up relationships, but there were far fewer people than there are, let's say, that you would have access to now. So like from the perspective of APIs, there are probably, thousands of people doing .NET, very interested in
Sure.
APIs and active, and millions doing them, but actually very active. But on the niche area I was in, there was maybe 5 or 6 people, maybe 10 people. So you needed to find them, get in touch with them, get them to be willing to talk to you, help you occasionally, and then of course you had to be able to. Not, it's not like there was a quid pro quo, but you had to be adding something to the community as well. They weren't just going to help you for the sake of it disappearing into the void. They wanted some outcome from that. And actually, one of the things I did was I wrote an FAQ on the topic, which then got published, and it saved them a lot of hassle getting emails from other people with simple questions because I had the FAQ already up and running. So that took a lot of workload off them. So, again, I kind of contributed back as quickly as I could.
That's great. I mean, it sounds like it's a very collaborative environment, right? And I think now comparing that to what we have today, which is a completely collaborative environment, right? Like I don't know very many folks who completely learn themselves, right? Like they're using something that somebody else has created, or they're getting help from somebody else, right? So obviously, over the course of that time, like technology has advanced in a way that allows us really to learn different ways, right? So thinking about Bryan back then and how Bryan learns now, how much is similar or different than how you go about learning new topics and kind of building new things?
How much is similar and different? So I think I went through a transition myself. So I started work. I'll get back to the point, but yeah, bear with me for a
You're
moment.
fine.
So I started work doing .NET at around .NET 2, and I had a learning C# book, and I pretty much sat there and read it page by page. And then my boss came along to me one day and said, "Oh, my boss is really happy that you're not just reading the book anymore, but you're actually typing now."
Yeah.
But
Oh, wow. Okay.
they hired me into a job for a language I didn't know, so I had to learn it. So I had to learn it. I had to read it. Um, so I became, okay at .NET 2.0, .NET Framework 2.0, and whatever as it moved on. But then as I kind of came comfortable with it, I think I kind of paused learning. I was picking things up a bit, but I was the only developer in the company doing .NET, so there wasn't really anyone to talk with. Um, so my learning somewhat slowed down and came to a pause. And then sometime after moving here, so that was in Budapest. I lived in Budapest for a few years after finishing up in Ireland.
Sure.
Then I moved to the US in 2007 and 8. And I was working away and I wasn't learning as much as I would have. I didn't notice I wasn't learning as much.
Okay.
And then there was one conversation at one of the companies, and one of the guys made some, relatively straightforward comment about C#. And it was, oh, I didn't know that. And I said, I should have known that.
Yeah.
And that kind of clicked, kind of like a switch. I need to get back to my active learning. So to go back from the passive learning of just picking it up as I'm going along and seeing something, back to the books, but also back to meetups. To start going to meetups. So I started actively very much going to meetups at that point. And I was going to probably 4 a month.
Okay.
And 2 of them might be good, one might be great. Sorry, 2 of them might be good and 2 might be poor, or one might be good and the other 3 are bad. But it would still be a good chance to meet people. But that switch then to going to getting more books, going on Pluralsight, watching the courses. But then the really big one that changed for me for the learning, for switching to very active learning again, was writing a blog. So that forced me to really learn as much as I could about what I was going to write about, to write it as right as I could. Not perfect. I don't care about that. And I'm happy when someone tells me I'm wrong, I'll fix it. But to write it so that it's clear for somebody else. And writing my blog has really been how I've learned the most from the very technical perspective over the last 10 years, because it forces me, again, as I say, to dig a little bit past what I need to know so that I can be sure that I'm doing it
Yeah.
not necessarily the best way, but definitely a good way.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. And I love the phrase like captive learning or adaptive learning, or because I think, especially in tech, it's our responsibility to be paying attention, because if we don't pay attention, we're just limiting ourselves in the future. One thing that you said, you didn't directly say it, and I'll kind of ask a question and we have a conversation around it, is like this idea of like writing for yourself in the future, right?
Mm.
Or writing to as a part of, as a mechanism for learning, right? And I think you're very guilty of that, where you'll
Yeah.
have an idea like, oh, I want to learn this particular thing, and instead of researching it and then quote unquote learning it and
Mm.
putting it to practice, you'll put it down so it's available in the ether forever, right?
Yeah.
So, what was kind of the primary reason for that? Because I know a lot of folks that do that, like the idea of like writing, like if you're looking up something and you do a Google search and like your blog that you wrote 2 years ago comes up, right? Like, oh, I've blogged about things that I've forgotten plenty of times. So like, at what point in time did you realize that like that way of learning was really going to work for you?
Very early on, I
Yeah.
think. So I had this kind of idea in my head. I want to write this so that somebody else who doesn't know about this topic can read it and divine what they want from it. And that person could be me 6 months later or a year later. And quite a few of my blog posts are very short, and they pretty much have a little thing at the top going, "This is for future Brian when I forget," because I know I will forget. So there's one on cores. I always forget. You get that cores error, and I'm always going,
Yeah.
"What do
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
need to change? I
Yep.
can't remember."
And then you
And then
open up
I
everything, because why not?
sure, and then you kind of go back. Oh, it's that thing I need to change.
Yeah.
It's not this application. It's that application. So I write it down for myself, or even something as simple as PowerPoint presentation. You can get it into that presentation mode where you can see your notes of your slide, but on a single screen. I can never remember how to do that, so I wrote a little blog post to my future self, so that when I'm at a conference and I want to run through the thing once more on my
Yeah.
laptop, but I don't have a
Yeah.
second screen, I can go through it.
Yeah.
There's a load like that.
Yeah.
So, and again, writing it so that somebody else will understand it means you're going to write it so that you'll understand it too.
Yeah. And one thing that I would love to ask you too, especially as you write technical blogs, is, I think you mentioned this briefly, right? By the time you write the blog post and it's out there, it's probably already to an extent like outdated, right? So like what sort of mechanisms, or do you not care, and that's fine too, of like keeping your blogs up to date, or keeping the reader or the viewer aware that like, oh, this content might not be 100% accurate?
I don't worry about that very much. And because if I write something about that .NET 3.1 and it only applies to that,
Yep.
there are still people using it. It doesn't matter that it's past LTS, it's out of date. People are still using it.
Yeah.
I've got things written about Entity Framework 5 and 6, and I still get emails about them sometimes.
Sure.
They won't even compile now, but they're still useful to somebody. That
Yeah.
there's always someone who's a few versions behind you. So no, I will occasionally, when I figure out that I've written something in a poor way, I won't get rid of it, but I might put a little thing at the top saying, there's a better way of doing
Yeah.
it. See here.
Sure.
But sometimes the bad way is what that person needs, because maybe they're constrained by something else.
Yeah.
They can't use the new library. They can't use this other package. So I don't worry about it. And I don't get upset when I write something that's wrong. I know some people that are afraid of writing because they don't want to be wrong. It's kind of, we're all wrong. I mean, it's no big deal. I've put out there's been plenty of times when I've had to go back and fix something. I'll go back and I'll fix it. But I won't get embarrassed if I've made a mistake. It's kind of, it's a mistake. No big deal.
Yeah. So when did you realize that write you and this, and I don't mean to sound that I don't this to me like overly um anyway. So when was the first time you realized that, oh, I'm a fairly decent writer and I actually like writing? Because I think for a lot of folks, like we've talked about this before, like I don't think I'm the best writer, and like
Mm.
I get super in my own head about writing, right? When did you realize that writing was something that you were interested in or enjoyed doing, and it was like the preferred way for you to kind of like quote unquote create content? Was it a part of like that writing a 200-page paper, or was it before then?
It could have been, I enjoyed that. I mean, it was a struggle. But I think when I started writing blog posts and I saw that people were responding to them. So, I had these little comments thing at the bottom and people would say, thank you. You realize that you're helping someone and that you've obviously written clearly enough for it to be of benefit to them. And definitely my ability to write clearly, I think, has improved over the years. So, I mean, looking back at some of my earlier blog posts, they're okay, they're right, they're correct as much as I can say, but they might have been more long-winded, more verbose. And now I'm kind of down to the bare bones when I can. I mean, sometimes I deliberately puff it up a bit so that it isn't just, here's the answer. This is a question, here's the answer.
Yeah.
But that's fine. But I really enjoy writing. I actually at times feel compelled to write, that I haven't written for a couple of weeks. I need to write something.
Yeah.
I don't have that at the moment, and I haven't actually written for about a month. But I've been at a few conferences and things. It became kind of like an addiction in a sense. I need to get something written. I need to get this out of me. I figured something out. I need to get it down on paper before I forget. You know, a
Yeah.
lot of it is like that.
Yeah, like the, oh my gosh, I need to put this down is very interesting. I think of that. So like my preferred way to create content or kind of work through ideas is like video content. Um, and there's a whole bunch of things with video content that are challenging or interesting or whatever. But I think one of the things I'd love to kind of hear from you is like, is blogging like, do you keep go like you've probably tried in your life like other ways to be creative, right? And I think writing, especially writing blogs, is like it's like a very specific art. Like I think you're either good at it, you're mediocre at it, or you're pretty good at it, right? Like so. How often do you go back to writing? Like you have other probably avenues of ways to be creative, but like, do you write in your free time? Do you
Hmm.
write? Yeah, like let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I write in my free time. And back when I used to commute to the office, I would write on the train. Yes, I mean, I sometimes if I'm going to a doctor's appointment, I'll take the laptop because I know I'm going to have a half an hour sitting in the lobby or something, and I'll do a bit of writing then. So yeah, I tend to be easy to have a disruption and then continue from that thought later. So like I even remember what, back in the days of being at the office, 5 o'clock would come, I'd be in the middle of a line of code, I would stop
Sure.
and I would be able to continue the next day. Whereas a lot of people need to be, excuse me, in the zone and they won't put it down.
Yeah.
Now I can walk away.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah. No, I think I'm kind of maybe a little bit of both. Like sometimes I struggle stepping away from things, but also there's other times where I'm just like, I just gotta get away from this and I don't
Mhm.
know, go touch grass or play guitar or whatever it is, right?
Oh, yeah, I go for my run. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
let it interfere with my health. I mean, depending on the temperature when we finish this call, I'll go out for a run. But I have a
Yeah.
feeling it's going to be into the 80s, which is a little too hot for me.
Yeah, unless you're running by areas that like are shaded. Like I mean, this is nothing to do with tech, but like I if I'm in the sun for too long, I feel like I'm going to actually die. Like I don't do well with like the sun directly on me for I don't know why, but anyway.
Yeah, I burn. I'm pale
Yeah.
skinned. I mean, I
Yeah.
used to be blonde when I was a kid, but that's no more.
Yeah. Yeah. So, kind of going back to like this idea of like always learning, right?
Hmm.
Obviously with a lot of writing, I assume that you probably also do a lot of reading, right? So,
Yeah.
is reading like articles or other blog posts or documentation, is that like your preferred way to learn? Like
I
I'd like to
like
kind
a,
of know.
I like a mix. So, a lot of the Microsoft stuff is their docs website and their samples. But I was actually looking at a Pluralsight course just yesterday, looking for an answer to a very specific question. I don't think I found it. I think the course is out of date, but I might look for the next version of the course to see if I can find it. Or it could simply be that I was looking for one layer a little too deep. And actually, that question I've sent to a friend of mine to see if he knows the answer. So I tend to mix it up. I mean, obviously, Stack Overflow is a wonderful resource for learning, as is Copilot. But I the documentation and then some of the books. So books like Andrew Locke, fantastic books. They
Yeah.
go so deep and so detailed. Or Steve Gordon's Pluralsight courses. I remember kind of he had one on dependency injection. And I was thinking, I know most of dependency injection.
Sure.
And to be fair, I did, but there were a few modules in it, and it was, oh, I've really learned something about that now. Trouble is, I've forgotten it because I didn't write it down. So uh,
Yeah,
I need to go back to the course.
it's quite funny, and I know Andrew and Steve as well. It's funny that like there are some folks that we know, especially like in our community, which is the .NET community. It's like, yeah, these are the people that I don't want to say know everything because that's not fair to them, but they know a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like, whenever Andrew Locke posts like one of his blog posts on like configuration, it's like 40 pages. You're like, I mean, I just like do the configuration that like I think everybody else does. And like he goes down like this completely complete like, thesaurus of sort of things. It's quite impressive.
Yeah. Actually, Andrew has been he's been helpful a few times. There was a few blogs I wrote, and they were using kind of the dependency injection incorrectly, where I could end up with multiple containers. And he wrote to me and explained it, and then I corrected it and put a thank you to him. So again, people like him, they have this deeper knowledge because he literally writes a book on it, and he dives into the source code from Microsoft and doesn't depend on just the documentation. And to be fair, at the time, the documentation, or maybe it was a tweet from David Fowler, said that the container thing is broken in a few different ways.
Sure.
I didn't know about it, and I wouldn't even have known which ways. But then Andrew was kind of, polite enough to have read my blog post and went, "It's broken this way, and what you're
Yeah.
doing will be a problem." Okay, what's the better way? And then he said, "Oh, do this instead." So I learned. Again, I've forgotten, but I know that one's written down, so I can go back and check. And it may be fixed by now anyway, with .NET 7 and 8 coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting to know too, like obviously one of the things that we've talked about a bit so far is like always learning. And I think a part of that is like learning like new topics or new areas, right? Like, and right now in tech, like we have like this constant, like, are you learning the new thing? Are you learning containerization? Are you learning Kubernetes? Are you learning AI? Are you learning these things, right? Like, what are some of the things that you've kind of seen in your career in tech, like microservices, monoliths, like do this, do that? Like, what are some of the trends that you think actually make sense, and which some of the ones that are, I guess, they're, I don't want to say fads because that's not fair, but they're going to turn into something else in the future.
Before we talk about that, can we go back a tiny, tiny bit?
Please.
So you mentioned about how we're always learning, and that's actually something I'm a little worried about. So there are programmers who want to always learn, and maybe I class myself in that. But there are plenty of people that don't. For them, it's a 9 to 5 job, and that should be fine too.
Mm-hmm.
So I get a little concerned when people talk about our industry as though, you have to be doing these things independently. You have to have your, just to go with the meme from recently, the X number of GitHub contributions. It's a job for some people. It's not their hobby, and that has to be okay too. So I worry a little bit about our industry having such a focus on having to always be better, more and more and more, because people have lives, people have families, people have problems. It isn't the only thing we do, and yet we're judged so heavily on what we've done outside of 9 to 5 that I find that a little bit of a concern.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I think one of the big things that I am a proponent of is finding what brings you joy. Because I think in tech, there's a lot of things that a lot of mistakes that we can make that will lead us to working on things that don't bring us joy. I'm not saying that like we should be super excited if our job is like building some website that like is reading from a SQL database. Like you don't need to be passionate about that, but like you need to be passionate about the idea that you're trying to solve some problem, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're not passionate, you'll eventually, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, you'll become complacent, and then you'll kind of regret going into work, and you'll be kind of somebody that is not exciting to have a conversation with, and that'll leak into your personal life and all that sort of stuff. It's a spiral. That's my opinion. So when I talk to people about, learning, is like you can be a polyglot or a generalist, and if that's part of your work, but there should be things that you are interested in, right, in tech. And if that's not the case, that's totally fine. But that's what is important for me, is I need to find areas of tech that I'm interested in. So I highly recommend for folks is like find an area and just find an area that you're interested in and just learn that area. And you don't need to be an expert like some of the folks we've been talking about, but you should be able to feel comfortable talking about it with your peers or trying to solve a problem or what have you, or at least know the ways that you can go about solving that problem.
No, I would agree that I think that's a fine thing to espouse, but I think we also have to accept that, you and I, we go to meetups.
Sure.
Of all the people I've worked with, there might have been 3 or 4 others who went to meetups on a regular basis.
Sure.
There's no one I worked with who blogs, who writes, who has a podcast. We tend to be in a relatively small grouping.
Yes.
And then the people like we meet at meetups are part of that small grouping too. And then there's everybody else. And again, just to kind of to hammer it home, I'm just afraid that we put too much of an emphasis on this sort of the demand to always learn more, always be better. You have to do it in your own time. Again, it's a job for some people and it's not their hobby. But yeah. I'm not trying to keep us on this topic.
No, you're very argumentative. That's totally fine.
Sure.
No, I do totally agree. And that I kind of preface that a little bit. Like, it's okay to just want to have tech as a job, right? I think that, I think what ends up becoming true for a lot of people is that if you treat tech as a job, it'll just be that. And there might be a potential time in the future where you're kind of stuck, right?
Sure.
And that's fine. Maybe folks don't mind getting stuck, or they're totally fine with like not progressing or getting raises or whatever. Maybe they're just happy with what they're doing, happy enough for what they're doing. I guess my meta point is if you want to be in tech and you want to grow your career, you want to grow your network, you want to like be a part of this community, like it's really important for us to be learning and be paying attention to what's going on. And like you say, meetups or conferences or creating content, reading content, consuming content. I think that was kind of my point. But it is very, very true that we run consistently into the situation where like, the more that you're in the community, I think you're also more very guilty of comparing yourself with others in the community, which is problematic. Which I think we run into a lot, like this idea of imposter syndrome, or am I doing the right thing? Like, I think a lot of people always worry about like, oh, am I learning the right way? Or am I choosing the right career, the right tech that I want to be focused on, right? So from your perspective, like, how can we navigate that? If you're in the community and you're doing these things, what can you do to kind of mitigate the potential risks?
Well, so having, said what I said about not expecting people to have to learn, for those that want to learn, I think, transitioning to that active learning is the big thing. Whether it's attending meetups or reading the book or listening to the audiobook. So a lot of audiobooks, a lot of tech books are now on various audio systems. I find them in Libby. So Libby is, just for people who haven't heard of it, Libby is your local library's audio book and ebook system. It's free. It is amazing. And in states like Massachusetts, there are multiple library networks. I'm a member of 4 different library networks. I can borrow audiobooks from 4 different networks. So if it's available, not available in one, I can get it from another. So, start using those kind of resources. Listen to podcasts. watch the events from Microsoft Build, use the tooling from the likes of Copilot, and try to understand, the code that you're getting. Don't just accept it. Or same thing with Stack Overflow. Don't just copy paste it. Have a good read of it. Again, having said what I said about not expecting learning, it is fantastic to learn because it increases your earning potential. It makes interviews easier.
Yep.
You will feel much more comfortable in your job. You might go from lacking confidence in what you're doing to feeling a degree of, yes, I know what I'm doing and control. And actually, there's a presentation I gave recently on getting into technical blogging. I have this sort of idea that I think it's easy in quotes, to be in the top 10% of developers because, 90% of people are not actively learning would be my estimate.
Yep.
So if if all you're doing is trying to improve your skills every week. I have this thing that if I haven't learned something in a week, I feel like I haven't had a good week. So if you can kind of transition to that once every month or whatever it is, you will all of a sudden realize that, compared to people that are not actively learning, you are significantly farther ahead.
Yeah.
But again, it has to be your choice. And, realize you're giving up something else. For me, that's easy. It's my hobby. I enjoy it, but I will also make sure that I go and run my 5K or whatever it is. So you have to find that balance too.
Yeah. I think the balance thing is really important too, because I think there are certain areas of the developer community that like tech and being a developer is like their entire life.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you mentioned kind of like the GitHub contributions chart, right? Some people take a lot of pride in that, or like the 10x developer meme or whatever it is. Right. And I think, now I think we're getting into a state where like people that talk like that, I think the community immediately identifies them as red flags. Right.
Yeah.
Whereas if that was 10 years ago, like maybe those are people that we all aspired to be like, oh, I want to be the person that, runs 15 open source projects and they blog 40 times a week and they do all these things. Right. I think now a lot of folks really value the time away from technology, even though tech is still a huge part of all of our lives. It's really important for us to do things that are not tech oriented because I don't know, there's been studies that proven if you step away from something, you end up coming back with the answer eventually, right? Like if you're trying to solve a problem, take a break, step away, whatever. Here's a question for you. So when we go talk about different, ways to create content, one of the great ways is going out and speaking in front of folks or talking to folks. And like you mentioned that you just did a talk on like getting into blogging. Like what interests you? Because some people just have no interest in that, right? Like I don't want to speak, like I don't want to be a public speaker or whatever. Like what is it about public speaking or talking to developers? Like what about it really brings you joy?
So I've kind of had a variable relationship with it. So I started podcasting about 8 years ago. So I would view that as public speech as well.
Sure.
But that's very controlled. I edit it if I make a big mistake, which doesn't happen too often. But it's not live like this where you have to mind every word you say. But that I found thoroughly enjoyable because I was learning things. And then I was building relationships and I got to talk to people I would have absolutely no business talking to.
Yes.
As a developer in wherever, I had Scott Allen on at the time, Bill Wagner.
Yeah.
And then, kind of talking to someone like that tends to open the door to someone else because they kind of go, oh, like John Skeet. Oh, because, well, Bill Wagner obviously trusted you to talk. He trusted you, and so I'll trust you. And, it kind of goes like that. So you get to talk to these people and learn directly from them and ask them questions that you're interested in. And again, without that access or without the podcast, why would they talk to you? You're not going to jump on a call for an hour with John Skeet about nothing.
Yeah, I talk about this a lot because, coincidentally enough, I also have a podcast and I've also been very fortunate to talk to people that I have no right talking to. I think part of that is like if you are extroverted enough to reach out and say, hey, would you like to be a guest on my show? Like, most people are nice and they'll either say, no, thanks, I'm not really interested, or I'm busy, or they're like, sure, why not? And the folks that say, sure, why not? Like, you get to put their name on the list of people that you've had as your guest. People can go and watch those. And then that also really fills, and this is to be a bit inside baseball, like in your pipeline, right? Like, I don't have to reach out to people as much, or it's not as hard for me to get people to be on my show as much now, because people just go to my website and they're like, oh, like Isaac has interviewed Scott Hanselman and Kelsey Hightower and Liz Fong Jones and so on and so forth. Like, all these people in tech that are like people recognize. So they're like, oh, there must be some credibility. Like, Isaac must do something right. Otherwise, like, people would say, oh, don't be on Isaac's podcast because it's bad. Right. Yeah. So it's very selfish in the way it's like, if you can get people in your network, you become a proven commodity. I think that's true about any world, any community. Like, tech just happens to be like, the community is so small that everybody kind of knows the big names, right? Even if you don't know what they do, like, you know who they are.
True. Yeah. And again, trust, I think, is the big element. I had a few guests who, were very wary of coming on, and they wouldn't recommend me to their associates until the episode with them was published and out the door. It was sort of, I want to hear it first before I recommend you, and then the trust was built up.
Sure.
So you meet different kinds, but yeah, certainly the trust, and I suppose in a sense a level of respect. They respect that you're going to do something that's not going to reflect poorly on them.
Oh, sure.
And that's obviously a risk, because I often, so I have a kind of a thing at the start when I talk to people. You try not to say anything you wouldn't want to have made public.
Yeah, sure.
Even though it's a recording, I'll do my best to edit it out. It could still slip through, and it did happen once that a person did say something they didn't want made public. And I was going, yeah, sure, I'll edit it. But it was a much more nervous edit, because then I had to be sure it wasn't in there. But again, he trusted me. He didn't say, all right, delete the whole thing, because he knew I would do as I had offered.
Yeah, I do a similar thing. Like, before we got on, I asked you, like, well, what are things you're okay talking about, not okay talking about? Like, I have the ability to edit as well. Like, I've been a guest on enough podcasts or other people's things to realize that, like, if I'm going to say something, like, it's just going to be out there, right? Like, so I've kind of delivered the mindset of like, okay, well, everything that Isaac says is just going to be out there. So, like, when people send me like, oh, do you want a recording to listen? I'm like, no, I don't want a recording, because at the end of the day, like, I probably said something that's not correct. I probably said something that's probably spicy, but at the end of the day, like, that's just who I am. Like, and people, if they're going to listen to a podcast with my name on it, they probably have some interest in me, or they might like me enough to not skip that particular episode. But again, like, there is always in my back and like, oh, did I say something wrong? Did I offend somebody? Did I make the wrong choice in how I worded things? Like, it's always a struggle, right? Especially as a host too.
Yeah, because you have to be thinking ahead. What's the next thing I'm going to ask? So there isn't dead air. And it's very, I was talking to a mutual friend of ours a few days ago that, it's very hard to keep talking for an hour. Now, for us, it's not too bad. It's an hour and we're done. But if you're on the radio or you're on TV and you have to go for 2 or 3 hours, it's very hard to keep that going without saying something that isn't going to annoy somebody.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think,
we're too harsh on those people when they make mistakes at times.
Oh, yeah. And I don't know how much sports radio you or anybody who's listening to this listen to. Like, sports radio is funny to me, and talk radio in general, right? Like, morning drive sort of radio is always really funny to me, because people are so, like, upset at some of the things these folks say. Like, oh, like, this person's take on this particular thing is the worst. And I have to remind people that this person has to talk for like 4 hours a day, every day. Yeah. And their whole job is to get listeners. So, of course, they're going to say something that is going to instill a bit of like irritation to get more listeners. Because I think one thing's been proven in the last like 5 years, 8 years, that anger and people being upset like brings in eyes. good, bad, or indifferent, right? So, you see that when specific person on Twitter goes on some tirade about something, like the most engaged tweets are the tweets where you say the stupidest thing, right?
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah,
and plenty of the
yeah,
social media companies have figured out that anger is what is clicked on, and they
yeah,
feed it to you. You don't have to name any of them, but there's been
yeah,
plenty of documentation of that. So yeah, but again, to your point, it is hard for people to just keep going, and we should be. I mean, there are obviously times people have said things that are inappropriate, and by any measure they are. But there are plenty of times where it's just hard to keep that going from the perspective of public speaking. To not to put people off, it is a fun thing to do. And you were asking me that about the public speaking, so I'll go back to that. So
sure,
I was presenting some years back, so pre-pandemic, on Poly, and I had what I considered quite a polished presentation on it.
sure.
So there was something like 60 slides, and it had to last 60 minutes.
Mhm.
And I knew that by minute 45 I needed to be on slide 41 or something to be
Oh
on
wow.
schedule.
Okay. Okay.
It was
Yeah.
way too manicured,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I got so bored of giving that talk
Mm,
that I kind of retired it. And even though people had asked me for it, I said, no, I'm done. I really don't enjoy this anymore at all.
yeah.
But then I had to give two talks relatively recently on topics that I was not nearly as manicured, and there was much more audience interaction. So there was questions and discussions, and then I would present some information and talk. And then I gave one at Boston Code Camp on technical blogging, and it started off with a kind of a back and forth with the audience, and that I actually found out is a much more
Yeah.
enjoyable type of
Yeah.
presentation to
Yeah.
give. And then
Yeah.
letting people interrupt or suggest things.
Yeah, I think, and that's a great topic to kind of talk about a little bit too, because there's this balancing act, right? Because I think that you want, as a speaker, I mean, what the one of the best feelings you can have as a speaker is like your room is full, right? So like you go there and like it's a room and there's like 50 people or 60 people or however many people in there, right? Like standing room only, like, oh, people were excited, people wanted to come and see my talk, like that feels good as a speaker. However, and I can tell folks this like 100%, the more people in the room, the more separated you are from the audience, because then you're just kind of talking to a mass of faces that aren't going to like ask a question, or they're not going to want to engage with you most likely. But with a smaller group of folks, like maybe your room isn't full, maybe there's 10 people there, maybe there's 5 people there, maybe there's one person there, you can have like a direct impact on that particular attendee, right? And that means a lot. So it's like there's this balancing act of like scale, right? The amount of people that you could potentially reach with your ideas or with your content, but the amount of impact is lower. Unless like you're really, really good at what you do and you're able to kind of, pick people out of the audience and try to engage with them, but at the same time making sure that everybody's a part of the ride. It's a really difficult balancing act.
Oh, it is, yeah. And if you've got a large audience, you might get a few people who are willing to talk. So
Yeah.
then it becomes quite a siloed discussion with them. Whereas if you've got a small audience, it's easier to pick on people that haven't spoken. Can you say, oh,
Yeah.
what about you, sir? What about you, ma'am? What have you considered this? And they're much more willing to be open in those. And yeah, it is a very enjoyable back and forth. And it makes it different every time too, which
Yeah.
is enjoyable. There's a friend of mine who got a bit tired of presenting as well. So he gave up doing kind of prepared presentations and instead does live coding things with
Yeah.
a little bit of talk.
Sure,
And then
sure.
it's all back and forth. So, what he said was he wants to get something out of it too.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that in a selfish way, but he has to enjoy it.
Oh,
You
for
know,
sure.
he's giving, an hour away twice a week. It's away from family, it's away from whatever. It might be remote, but it still has to have there has to be some joy in it for him, and not just I'm talking to the screen and blah, whatever it is.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Like, and like we haven't even talked about like the idea of like live streaming or live coding or that, because that's a very interesting topic I don't have a lot of experience with, but I've watched a lot of it or watched semblances of there. I think one thing that's very, very interesting too, and this is like to go back to like the learning aspect in general, but also like the way that you create content is things that bring you joy. Obviously for you, it's blogging.
Yeah.
And if you find other things that are interesting, it's really, really important. I think one thing that I'd love to kind of, as we're getting close to the end here, one thing that I'd love to ask you is like, when you think about like, what is your thought process around creating things? Like, do you have like a list of things that like, oh, these are things that I'd love to blog about, or talks or ideas for talks I'd like to put together, or like a demo idea that you're like, oh, how do I like this demo idea? Like, how do I put it into some way that other people can enjoy? Like, what is your creativity or your creation process like?
For the blog, it's primarily a problem I've come across that I can't find an answer to. So almost all of my blog posts solve something that either isn't explained well somewhere else or not explained somewhere else. It's relatively rare that I would blog about something that there's already a good answer to. And generally, they come out of my own work, or I'm trying to figure something out, or I'm trying to learn something. And it's kind of, well, I can't figure this out. And if I can't figure this out, there's a likelihood that somebody else can't figure it out.
Sure.
So I might as well write it down for them. So, if something takes me half an hour to figure out in .NET, either it's complicated and there's a lot of steps to it, or it's not explained elsewhere very well.
Yeah.
And it's often the latter. So a very good example, a buddy of mine with a small company, he has a small company. He was asking me to do up a demo for him of how to, in C# use HTTP client to call an API, his API, use basic authorization or authentication. I can't remember the word. And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. I'll do that for you. It's not easy. It is far from easy, because and before anyone says, no, that's really easy. No, you have to work out what his API is. You have to build a C# model to represent the thing that you're going to post. You have to create the HTTP client. You have to put in the basic authentication or authorization. You have to encode that string. You have to attach a header. You have to send it. Then you have to get back a response into another model. It's hideous. I spoke with Maria Nagaga about this as an example of, this is where, this is one of the things in .NET that should be easy. Sure. And she went, yeah, that's a really good example, and I don't know if anything came of it, but it was one of the conversations we had during our podcast, my podcast with her. So, again, that has been the most popular blog post I've written. So I wrote it 3.5 years ago. Consistently every month, it's either number 1, 2, or 3. So thousands and thousands of people are hitting the same problem, and there's nowhere else to find the answer because, well, Microsoft doesn't have a good documentation on it. And you might say, they have it on HTTP client. Yeah, but on a post, on creating the models, and on encoding the string, not all in one place.
Sure. Yeah, you gotta go like 2 or 3 different spots, right? Like, because that, there is this area of like, there's a gap in content in general, right? There's technical documentation, which is very like spec oriented. Like, this is what you're trying to, like, this is what the features of the product are and what the product does and all that sort of stuff. But like, that is nowhere close to like how to implement said feature for said product, other than like the Hello World example. And then like blogs and articles, their responsibility is to like fill in that gap, right? More than likely. So it's not surprising to me that like, people are trying to solve some problem, and they come across a blog post that like solves their particular problem because they can't find, because of gaps in documentation. And I think that's something that just exists because, as we know, documentation is very, very hard, and it's never right, and it's never 100% coverage, right?
Yeah. But I mean, I can imagine the person coming across from Node or something going, why do I have to deal with these classes? Like, why can't I have JSON? You go, well, no, you can't have that. Why do I need to do this, these 5 things? And they don't forget about it. I'm sticking with Node.
Sure.
That would be a reasonable outcome for that example.
Yeah, it is definitely and we're running close on time. So like we could talk about this whole thing about choosing technologies, which I think would be great for the next time you're on the show, because you will be on the show again. I can
Sure.
guarantee us that. But I love the idea of like, okay, so like there's all these things in tech. Like, how do we like decide what we want to do? Especially if you're getting started. Like I recently spoke at where I went to college. I went to spoke to like the students who are now like in the college curriculum that I graduated from 15 years ago or whatever it was. And like I was talking to them about some of the decision makings, and they're like, I mean, we're just trying to like get a job. Like, we don't care about what technology we're using. I'm like, but you should care, because like if you really want to get into a job and you're like doing mainframe applications, maintain mainframe apps, because that's still a job out there. Like you want to be like hyper aware of like what sort of things are interesting to you.
That's very difficult, because you don't have
Experience. Yeah.
Yes, you're not in the industry. You don't know what the trends are. You don't necessarily, and it can be regional too. I remember talking to some people at NDC London saying .NET is super popular in London.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it may be, or it may just be in the finance sector that they were in.
Sure.
It's losing popularity in the Boston area. Now, that doesn't mean it's gone for good, but it's in decline and has been for quite a few years. So it's very hard to know.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, this has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate you taking some time to chat with me, Brian. And we're at the end of time.
Welcome.
Yeah, this was great.
Thank you very much.
This was great. As we sign off, I do like to ask my guests, one final question that is a staged one. So if you can, kind of think about the conversation we've had about tech and creating content and blogging and career and all that sort of stuff. And if you only had one word to describe like that feeling that you get, like what would that word be for you?
Compulsion.
Compulsion. We've not gotten that one before. That is a good one. Compulsion. Excellent. Any particular reason for using the word compulsion?
That's how I feel when I can't figure something out. I need to learn it. And that's how I often feel when there's the idea of a blog in my head. I need to write this down. I need to get it out there. And I don't care whether someone reads it or not, but I need it written down and out of me.
Yeah. So for folks that want to read some of Brian's content, you can definitely take a look at his blog. If you internet search No Dogma blog, you'll find it. There'll also be a link to the blog in the show notes. Also, No Dogma podcast, which is the podcast that we've been talking about for a bit. Or you can follow him on Twitter. So Bryan J. Hogan. So with that, Brian, do you have any parting words? Anything you'd like to end with?
No, not at all. But I think you and I are going to make another podcast on my side in the next few weeks as well. We're going to talk about .NET, past, future, and past, present, and future, I think. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I think anybody who knows me or listens to this particular podcast knows I have no problem talking about anything. So anyway, thanks for Brian for being on the show and chatting with me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for the folks who are coming in and letting us know how much they enjoyed it. And again, I hope you enjoy your day. If you like this podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, follow, share, whatever the mechanism is on that particular platform that you're using, and reach out to me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and take care, everybody. Thanks, Isaac.